Okay, we're going to put a jack underneath the bike here, and I'll explain what we need this for here. In a few minutes it'll become obvious. Just get the back wheel off the ground. So now that you got the bike supported, pull the spark plug wires and remove the spark plugs. What we want to do is, while the bike's of course lifted, we want to put it in the top gear. So just kind of turn the rear tire and lift up on the shifter and just keep doing that until you can't shift anymore and you have it in basically the top gear. So what we're going to do now is we're going to use the rear wheel to drive the engine by turning the wheel, and of course you want it in the tallest gear because it's the easiest to turn the wheel and actually overcome the engine friction. So we'll go back to the other side of the bike here, and we'll get ready to remove the push rods. So in this procedure here, we're going to show you how to remove the push rods, and the reason why you would want to use a bolt cutter versus pulling the top end off is it's a lot more labor to remove all these rocker boxes so that you can actually move the push rod up. So what we do is we use a bolt cutter and we lift these push rod tubes and we cut these. There's a retaining clip here at the top of the push rod. You just stick a screwdriver in the little slot there and you kind of pry it out and remove all 4 of those. There's 2 in the front, 2 in the rear. Okay, now we got the clips out. We can lift these push rod tubes up so we can see the push rods becoming exposed. Also, it's not a bad idea to remove this connector so that it's not in your way while you're working on the push rods. And there's just a squeeze tab on the back. Push down on that and slide the connector off, and you can just leave that hang. No big deal there. We can push these 2 up. Okay, so before we cut these out, it's nice to get these up and out of your way. So we got a simple little device here, a paper clip and a rubber band. And you just wrap that around the rocker box bolt to hold that up. And we'll do the other one here. Keep them up and out of the way so we can move the push rods. So now what we do is we rotate the rear wheel and we watch the push rods move. Okay, and when these 2, this one's coming down, okay, that would be the intake push rod over there, and this would be the exhaust. So the intake closes. Now we're coming up on compression. That's why the spark plugs need to be out, so it makes it easier to turn. Exhaust opens. Exhaust closes, and now you're going to see the intake start opening right after the exhaust closes. See them both moving right there? I'm rocking it back and forth. That means this cam, the rear cam, is on overlap, and then consequently, or as a result, the front is on the base circle. And so what it means when it's on the base circle is that the cam lobes are not pushing up on the push rods, which in turn compresses the spring and opens the valve. And so what we have in the front cylinder now that the rear is on overlap, or both of them were moving, is we have both the springs and the valves are completely closed. So we have less force on this push rod so that when we cut it, it doesn't want to, of course, compress and come shooting out of the motor. So the next step here is to basically cut these 2 front push rods. And you want to kind of stay as, high as you can so that you don't mar up the tappet block and whatnot. And we just cut it out like so. Make sure your cutters is all the way through, and there you have it.
Did you explain why you use the bolt cutter?
The reason why we use a bolt cutter is it's the cleanest way to cut a push rod. If you tried to use a die grinder or something, you'd have a mess. And we'll do the intake. Be very careful here. You can see how that push rod wanted to, still wanted to move when it collapsed. And it wants to, of course, bend in the center when you go to cut it, which if you had the spring open or if you were up on the lobe of the cam would not be a pretty thing, because it really wants to come out of there. Now what we're going to do on the rear is we're going to rotate the motor so that these 2 lifters are moving. And how I do that, I basically just use my fingers in there and I feel when they're moving. So obviously I reach back here and turn the rear wheel. I can see the exhaust coming up, my fingers going down, and now they're essentially both moving. As I rock the wheel back and forth, I know I can cut the rear push rods out. Sometimes the bolt cutter don't quite get the job done, and you have to get in there with the pliers and kind of finish the job, or re-crimp it with the bolt cutters. There she goes. And of course the pushrod tubes and the pushrod will get discarded, as well as the retaining clips, because with the S&S Performance kit, whether it be the standard performance pushrods or the quickies, they're supplied with new tubes and retainers. The reason why you get new tubes is because this tube is so long from the factory that you don't have enough room below it here to get at the adjuster, and so we have some shorter tubes that we supply with our push rods to allow for adjustment. Now we're going to remove the cam chest so that we can install a cam. There's two methods of supporting the tappet, and you need to support the tappet so that when you pull the cam chest out, they don't fall in and get in your way. And of course you want the tappet in place when you put the new cam in. So one method is the paper clip. This used to be on those little binder clips, and I just basically pull it out of the binder clip and we grind the ends here so that they're sharp, and you stick them in the tappet like that and you catch the edges. So I'm going to stick these in like so and catch the edge of the tappet, and it just locks in like that, and the force that the spring pushes out on the tappet is enough to keep them from falling down. Okay, so to remove the cam cover, you need a 3/16 Allen wrench, and you just crack all these cap screws loose.
Keep it going.
So you can see that I got an oil pan under here, because when we take the last bolt out, of course the cam cover could break loose and we're going to get some oil splash out of the cam chest. So I'm at the last bolt here, and this cam chest is actually, or cover is going to stay tight, which is a good thing. Oh, there it starts to come loose. So we can get these bolts out of here, because we're probably going to drop them. And just kind of leave the bolt in, of course, but let the cam chest drain. And we're going to hang on to those bolts because we're going to need them to go back together. Take the last one out, but there's the inside of the cam cover. Next we'll take the outer chain out, remove this bolt and this bolt, and we'll get that taken apart. Before we go to take those loose, we're gonna put the bike back down on the ground. Remember, it's in gear, so by putting the rear wheel on the ground, we effectively stop the wheel from spinning, and that of course is going to stop the motor from turning over. And use a 9/16 for the top bolt here. You heard the thing engage, so it's not going to want to rotate now. And we just crack this bolt loose and switch to a 1/2" socket for the pinion gear bolt, and get them both cracked loose, and now we can just take them on out. Now this install is going to be a set of chain drive cams, and so all of these, this bolt, this chain, these sprockets is all going to get reused. The cam plate, the tensioners, everything here is pretty much going to be reused. Okay, to remove these, sometimes you need just a little bit of help on the pinion, but you can see there's just splines in here, so it's kind of like a slip fit. You can see it wanting to rock, but the pinion gear here needs just a little bit of help. And I'm not prying very hard at all. It's just enough to get it to start coming loose. Alright. The next step here is to remove 6 cap screws that hold the cam plate on. You got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. These 4 here are to retain the oil pump to the cam plate, so we're not going to take those off at this time. We just got to take our 3/16 Allen again and take these out. One thing that you're going to find too is this bolt here actually interferes with this hydraulic tensioner assembly. So you can crack it loose, but you can't quite get it out without, you know, forcing it. So I just turned it a little bit loose there, and then we'll move on to the rest of them, and we'll kind of ease that one out as the plate comes loose from the crankcase. Now these bolts are all the same length on the later models. Some of the earlier models had longer bolts here and here because there are dowel pins actually behind here, and so they need an extra longer bolt because the dowel pin takes away the threads in the case. So something to note if you're working on an older model. And so you can see the last bolt I got going here is the one that was interfering with that hydraulic tensioner, and it looks like it's going to come out without the cam plate forcing off. So now essentially the cam plate's loose. You can see it's ready to come out, and I got oil coming out because of course I've opened up some passages as I've pulled that plate away from the crankcase. So we'll let that drain here a little bit and pull it out. Now if my tappets are supported right, they won't fall in. It really just pulls out. Okay, so there's your oil pump and your suction side of the pump. So what we're going to be keeping here, of course, is the oil pump, the cam plate, the hydraulic tensioner on each side, and then we'll discard essentially just this cam and this cam here, and we're going to reuse this chain. Okay, so the next step is to remove the cam bearings. This tool is an expandable mandrel type of a blind hole puller, if you will, and it just inserts in the cam bearing. And it's important that you use the right tools for this because it's very easy if you don't have the proper tool to ruin the bearing, and if the bearing comes apart while you're trying to remove it, it can of course fall into the crankcase, and that means the whole motor's got to come out and be separated so that you can get the debris or the parts that fell in out. So make sure you have the proper tools. This particular tool is a Kent Moore tool, a Harley-Davidson tool. There are several manufacturers of tools. You can get them many different places. So we put the support plate on here. It just has some thumb screws to hold it in place. It always works best if you put the support plate on. Okay, we got all them tight. Now we need a thrust bearing and a nut installed on there. Thrust bearing is just to make it easier to turn, so that as it pulls the bearing out, it reduces the friction. And I just install that loosely so that I can feel the tool center on the bearing when I tighten it down. This tool takes 2 7/16 inches, one to hold it from spinning, the other one to expand the mandrel inside. Just making sure I'm centered in the bearing. That's good and tight. Okay, so now I'm just tightening the tool, and it's pulling the bearing right out of the crankcase bore. Okay, so now that we've got the old bearing out, we're going to go ahead and open up the hardware kit, installation kit from the S&S packaging, and we get out the new bearings. The difference between the stock bearing and the S&S bearing is this bearing has a cage in between the rollers, and there are less rollers in there, and so this would be more supportive of the cam. And as well compatible with the materials that the cam are made out of. So we of course, anytime you're installing a cam, whether you have 0 miles or 100,000 miles, we still recommend replacing the bearings. So what we have here is the cam bearing installation tool, and these are the brand new bearings from S&S. They basically just slide over this mandrel or arbor, if you will. And this is the same plate that we use to remove the bearings with, so we have a different arbor that threads in here to install the bearings. Okay, so when you're getting set up to do this, important thing to note is that there are letters and of course like a part number on the outside of the bearing. You want that to be on the outside or facing out as you press it in, because if you look at this cage and bearing close, what you'll see is that this is thicker and stronger than the inside, so you don't want to push on the side that isn't supported. So you always want to have the numbers out. That's the important thing to note here. So I got them both on here. I've adjusted the length of these so that the bearings, when I slide this in here, they can't fall off and of course get lodged down in the cam chest. So I just put the bearings on there, slide everything into place, and put my thumb screws on. One thing too that I guess is important to note here, this bike only has 1,800 miles on it, and we're not going to replace the tappets, but I guess I would recommend that if you have a bike that's around 30,000 miles or higher, replace the tappets. And the tappet replacement is really simple, I guess. You would just take these 4 screws off these tappet covers, remove the tappet covers. Of course, you'll need a gasket for that. And there's a dowel pin in here that retains the tappet from spinning. That just lifts straight out of there, and you pull the tappets right out the top, put the new ones in, put your dowel pin back in, put on your new gasket and your 4 cover screws, and that's the only thing in addition to what we're doing here to replace tappets. So really simple process. Of course, you would want to use assembly lube when you put the tappets in and that kind of stuff, as we're going to do here when we put the cams in. So now I got my plate on, and basically you just run these 2 mandrels in. It's not a bad idea, of course, to visually look inside here to see that they are aligned with the bores. And this looks good here, so I'll just take my wrench and run them in. Now, the arbor on the end of this threaded piece actually has a step on it so that it puts the bearing in roughly 20 to 30 thousandths past flush. And so it's got a predetermined install height, if you will, in the case to get that bearing centered on the cam journal. And now it's obviously seating because it's getting quite a bit tighter than what it was going together. So I just break it loose so it's not pushing on there, and I go on to the next one. And so there they are, installed. So we've taken the Loctite that was supplied from S&S out of the packages, and they supply the snap ring and the two cams. These are the Easy Start cams. They have the compression release trigger built right into the camshaft. Both of them centered on the exhaust lobes of the cams. And this particular cam is a 585 cam, chain drive cam. The procedure we're going to do now is install these cams in this cam plate. So we need to remove these two stock cams and install the S&S cams. Some things that are important to note here. This is the cam plate that we removed earlier, and this O-ring that is on the suction side of the pump. If you got a bike that's got any amount of time, pretty much, this bike only has 1,800 miles on it. I'm not going to put this O-ring back in there because experience is that the O-rings will get hard with a few heat soaks, and once they're disturbed and you put them back in, you're going to go back in the cam chest, because what will happen is that O-ring will not make a seal on this pump, and you've disturbed it by moving the cam plate ever so slightly, and that O-ring won't seal, and your flywheel cavity will fill up with oil, and the bike will not want to rev up. It'll just give you nothing but trouble. So for a 3-cent O-ring or whatever it may be, even if it's $1.50, it's worth replacing just to not have to go back in there. Okay, so enough about that. Another thing too is when we pull this off, there's this washer that you have to, of course, keep track of. We're going to reuse that washer. So pull that off of the rear cam and set that up by your outer chain drive. So to remove the cams, we need a snap ring pliers, and we just basically insert it into the snap ring here, expand it a little bit, and pry it off of there. Now there's a thrust washer as well behind this cam, so now that I've got that clip off of there, and of course we took the sprocket off of here, these cams are free to come out of here. The only other thing, of course, is this hydraulic tensioner. We could slide them out of there, but this tensioner is going to essentially eject from the body. So use a 3/16 Allen, and you basically just crack these two loose, take out at least one of them, so that the hydraulic body can swivel on the other screw. I'll show you that here in a second. See how it swivels out of the way? Now, of course, this piece here is free to come out, and you can set that aside for now. We're going to need it later, but you can take that bolt out if you want, but you don't need to. So I'm just grabbing both the cams and, sliding them out evenly from the cam plate. Okay. Now, one thing that's probably worth doing is of course, here's the orientation of the chain. This is the outside, that's the inside. It spun this direction. It's probably good shop practice to put something in the same direction that it was before. Probably not necessary, but that's what we're going to do with our install. So I'll just ease the cam out of the chain here. Okay. Noting which is the outside, and then right away I'm just going to grab the other cams and insert them in the chain. Okay, so we'll stick the rear cam in with there, and as we do that, we want to make sure that this dot aligns with the other dot so that the timing is correct. And you can see right there I'm off a tooth, so I'll just shift the chain around as I go here, and now those appear to be aligned. Okay, now that we've got the timing marks lined up and we're ready to insert the cams in the cam plate, I'm going to put a little bit of assembly lube on the outer journals of the cams. And the bores are still plenty oily on this particular assembly, so I'm not going to bother with that here. And now I just basically need to insert the cams into the cam plate. Making sure, of course, not to let the cams come out of the chain and then, come out of timing with each other. So we just ease them in. Now that we've got the cams in, you can see that the two dots on the outside of the cam journal line up. So they're in time. and we just assemble things in reverse order. Here's a washer. You can put it on either direction for the front cam, and discard the old snap ring and install the new one from S&S. This snap ring is unique in that it is kind of a taco shape to it, or a potato chip shape. And so what that does is, of course, preloads the cam into the cam plate to retain oil pressure, because this cam, both front and rear cam journals, are fed with oil from the pump. So I'll make sure it snaps into place. Looks good, everything's tight there. Now we can put the hydraulic tensioner back on the other side. Just pop this in there either direction. Could go this way or flip it, either way, it's fine. And we need to use the Loctite supplied, blue Loctite, on these screws. Put a little on there, install that screw. Might as well pull this one out. We're going to have to have Loctite on it as well. Out. Now, if there's still oil in the tensioner, of course it's going to be a little hard to compress, but it's certainly doable with your fingers. Push it in and get it started, and then run it down with your wrench, and then we'll torque them up to the spec. Torque wrench here. Okay, that's how we get the cams in the cam plate. Okay, what we're doing here is we're checking pinion shaft runout. The Harley spec in the 2010 manual that we have is 0 to 10 thousandths. This one here is clearly at around 7 thousandths, and so we're within spec for the Harley chain drive cams. Now, if you were going to install a set of gear drive cams, you certainly wouldn't want to do it in this bike, or if you were going to do it in this bike and you had your heart set on a gear drive set, you would have to remove the flywheels, a very costly procedure, and of course correct the pinion shaft runout. There's numerous ways you can do that. You could just retrue the wheels, but of course if they are out of spec now, the chances of them coming out of spec again are pretty high, so you would want to either weld the crank pin, plug it, whatnot. But for our purposes of installing a chain drive, this is perfectly fine. It's within spec, and so we can proceed with a cam install on chain drive. We're going to put the cams and cam plate and oil pump back into the crankcase, and so we're going to use a new O-ring on the oil pump suction side. Okay, and it's good to get a little bit of lubrication on there so that it will slide in freely. And before we put these in, we want to put some assembly lube on the journals, and as well in the bearings here. So, throw a little bit on there. Roll the bearing around and make sure you distribute the oil well, so when we start it up we have oil. And since we rotated the motor, since we pulled this out, we have to look kind of through the pump here, and you can see there's flats. As you look through there, there'll be flats of the pump that drive on these flats of the shaft. So we need to get that shaft aligned, and we just turn the motor ever so slightly back up a little bit. Back up. A little more. Right there. Okay. So I'm kind of eyeballing right down the bore of the oil pump and just slide it into place. Couple things to make sure of course, these O-rings are in place. You can replace them as well. Not so much trouble with them. This thing doesn't have a lot of time on it. It's not as critical, of course, as that O-ring back there. So slid into place well. The tappets all are above the cams, so everything went in nice. Now we just put in the 5 bolts here to retain the cam plate to the cam chest. Again, there we need to install them with blue Loctite.
torque in this too?
96. Mhm. Okay. Before we put the chain on, we need to check our sprocket alignment. And so what you do is you put the sprockets on without the chain and put the bolts in so we draw everything up tight and it isn't going to be disturbed by us checking it. And just put them in snug. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take and put a straight edge on the sprocket and lay it across the other sprocket and see that we have alignment within the specified amount. And this of course is all in the Harley manual. So both of those are snugged up, and now we'll go get a straight edge and check it. Okay, so we got our straight edge, and what you're looking for is a 10 thousandths difference between these two. That's the max allowable. If it's more than 10 thousandths, you're going to require a different spacer behind this sprocket. So they have different washer thicknesses, I believe in 5 thousandths increments that will get you there. Now when I set this on the sprocket, I can't get my 10 thousandths in here. Now if in this case this sprocket is out farther than that one, so of course I want to align my straight edge with this sprocket. Of course if this one was out farther, I would align it with this face and then use my feeler gauge down here. So in our case here we have less than 10 thousandths, and of course I'm clearing that sprocket. So we're within spec. We can continue to assemble. We'll pull these back off, put the chain on, and torque them down with the red Loctite and move on. So next we have the outer cam chain assembly. Make sure that the cam washer is still in place. Timing this flat in line with that line, and of course your timing marks on your chain should line with the two bores. When you're done here you can put a straight edge on here, but of course this rear cam has a missing tooth, if you will, on the splines, and you have to align that with the missing tooth in the sprocket. Hopefully you can see that down in there.
Yes.
And we just align that. Before we get that in there, we got to get our hydraulic tensioner in place. And sweep this in here. Push the hydraulic tensioner back, and it should slide right on there, like so. Install the bolts with the red Loctite that was supplied with the kit. You could be pretty generous on that one because there's no oil passages to the plug or problems of that nature. The pinion, is not such a bad idea to clean the bore because it's got oil in there, and oil of course can contaminate your Loctite. This is Loctite 262. And put some on the bolt and put it in. So now we're going to torque the rear cam and the pinion bolt. We have a locking tool here that we could use to hold the thing from spinning. As well, you could leave it in gear and put the rear wheel on the ground and hold the rear brake to tighten that if you have an assistant, or it's kind of tricky. You can do it yourself with your elbow, but we'll just torque them up here. Again, it's a 1/2 inch for the pinion bolt and a 9/16 for the rear cam bolt. And there they are, torqued on. We'll move on, I guess, and put the cam cover gasket on there. We got to clean the gasket surface good so that the gasket can seal. Use a little brake cleaner solvent to on your rag to get it good and clean. After you got the gasket surface clean, put on the new gasket, and of course clean the cam cover, get all the oil out of here, and get it ready to go on so that everything's dry. And put it on here. A little Loctite on all your bolts, and torque them to spec.
You're torquing those every other bolt?
Just stagger it, you know, not so it's even. There's actually a bolt torque sequence in the manual. The important thing is just to not walk straight around it. Kind of increase the clamp load evenly. And then when you get towards the end and everything's torqued, you can kind of just walk straight around.
That was the family still owned the original farm. They probably had all the trucks and stuff.
We're going to talk about pushrod adjustment, and before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about I guess some of the anatomy of the lifter, or give people a visual on what you're actually doing when you adjust a pushrod. So what we have here is a stock twin cam lifter. It's been cut away so that you can kind of see the internals. Basically you have a spring, a one-way valve up here in this piston body, and then you have the cup for the push rod to fit into in the top, and a retaining pin. Okay, and so what you're doing when you're adjusting the push rod is the gap between the piston and the bottom of the lifter, you're closing that gap. And so for the lifter to do its job and adjust or compensate for the growth in engine height, and as things warm up and change distances, the hydraulic lifter, of course, this travel has to change and take all the valve lash so that your valve train is quiet. So what you're trying to do is to give this the maximum adjustment. You want to adjust this piston so that it's in the center of that travel in between this distance here. Well, if you measure this with the calipers, it's roughly 200 thousandths of an inch. And so what we want to do is adjust this down about 100 thousandths of an inch. So an S&S Pushrod has 32 thousandths or 32 threads per inch. So one revolution gives you 32 thousandths of length in the pushrod. So as we try to achieve 100 thousandths, we would want to go one turn at 32 thousandths, two turns at 64, three turns at 96, and then just over three turns is going to give you that 100 thousandths. So what we generally refer to for adjustment on a pushrod is flats. Anytime you're talking in terms of flats, you're essentially referring to a six-sided hexagonal shape. And so you stick a wrench on a set of flats, because a wrench is basically shaped like this, and so you turn it once, pull the wrench off, and turn it to the next flat on that hex. And so when we turn it 20 flats, we would do that 20 times, okay? Or sometimes they refer to that as 2.5 turns or 3.5 turns, that kind of thing. So it can be termed both ways, either flats or in the number of turns. So Another topic that we should cover would be the limited travel spacers. S&S has a product called a LT kit. It's a limited travel washer. What this washer does is basically turns your hydraulic lifter into a solid lifter. You could take a set of hydraulic lifters out of an engine, and generally speaking, putting a set of solids in their place would, of course, not give like a hydraulic lifter will. And so the advantage there is that you don't have the collapsing of the lifter under high RPM. And so the LT kit, of course, is going to maintain valve control and not collapse the lifter at high RPM, so that we get the benefit of improved timing. So generally speaking, if you were to put a solid lifter in place of a hydraulic, you would certainly achieve more horsepower, and that is the whole idea behind the LT kit. So what effectively happens when you put this in this lifter is that 200 thousandths I was talking about becomes roughly 100 thousandths. And so when we adjust this lifter down to that washer, we've now raised the floor up and taken away some of this travel. There's still, of course, oil inside of this LT kit, so there's a reservoir of oil there that can, of course, work its way through the one-way valve and pump up the lifter. But we bring the plunger down, or the piston down, so that it is essentially just above that limited travel spacer or washer. And then we will bring it down so it touches, and then we back it off one full turn, so 6 flats. And I'll go through that procedure here actually on a bike, so that we can understand better how to do it in the real environment. So with the limited travel spacer installed, you have the benefit of a solid lifter with the quiet performance of a hydraulic lifter. We're going to talk about adjustable push rods here. S&S has 2 versions of adjustable push rods. We have the standard push rod here, which is the cheaper of our push rods. It in a twin cam, it installs without removing the rocker boxes. Basically, it would have to go up and in, and you need to remove the tappet cover. Okay, so not too inconvenient. Very feasible. At least you don't have to remove the rocker box. We also have the quickie push rod, and if you can see how the quickie push rod collapses much farther than the standard push rod. And the advantage of that is, of course, that you can install it without removing the tappet cover. Okay? The standard push rod, also on an Evolution engine, you would have to remove the rocker boxes to use the standard push rod. So if a guy switches to the quickie, you certainly have a little bit more expensive push rod, but you certainly will save the money in labor without the added expense of removing the rocker boxes and, of course, the tappet cover on a twin cam. The S&S Pushrod kit comes as you see it here, and it has these tubes and, of course, the clips. The tubes that come with it are necessary because the stock tube is substantially longer, and, of course, since it's longer, you can't push it up far enough on the motor to be able to get at the adjuster underneath here. And I'll kind of show you right here. If that tube, if the stock tube was in this scenario, you would cover up the adjuster and you wouldn't be able to get at it. Okay, so when you buy a set of S&S push rods, they come with a set of tubes so that you can basically install them without taking anything else apart. All right, we're going to go through the procedure to adjust push rods, install and adjust. I've already got one push rod in here, kind of for a visual purpose, but first thing you do before you install a push rod or start adjusting them is to make sure that you have the cam or the cylinder that you're going to install the push rods into on the base circle. And how we do that is basically we raise the vehicle with a proper jack, pull the spark plugs, and put the transmission in high gear. So to find the proper location of the base circle on say the rear cam we're going to set up for, I'm going to watch for overlap on the front cam. Okay, so I want to know when both of these lifters are moving. I'm just going to spin the rear wheel, and the outer lifter is, of course, the exhaust, the inner is the intake, and right now I have them both moving. Okay, and of course I could see that this one was not moving at the same time. So I have the front cam on overlap, the rear cam is on the base circle. Now this particular engine has a set of S&S Easy Start cams, and what that means is on the exhaust lobe we have the compression release trigger. Okay, so if you were to put the cam on the base circle and actually stop on that trigger, your valve or push rod would be opened 25 thousandths, okay? And that would give you an erroneous adjustment. So what you need to look for on the exhaust push rod is that you're not on the top of that trigger. And what we'll do now is we'll put in the exhaust push rod and I'll show you that we're not on that trigger, or we'll look for that to move. So I got a set of quickie push rods here, S&S tubes. I have my O-ring in place, top and bottom. I'm going to slide this in place, extend the adjuster, and run it down until we basically feel the push rod get tight in the cup of the rocker arm up in the box, and of course the cup in the lifter. And that's what we would call, you know, zero lash, or run them down till you have no lash or up and down movement in the push rod. Okay, so I can feel the push rod. You can hear it moving there. I have a little bit of lash and I back it out just a little bit and I can feel it getting tight. Okay, and then there's the adjuster nut that I held up as I was moving the adjuster down. So that's right there ready to be snugged up. Okay, these push rods have 32 threads per inch, so my target is essentially 20 flats or 3 1/3 turns. Okay, so I'm going to hold the bottom part of the adjuster and I'm going to turn the top part of the push rod 20 flats when I go to adjust it. Okay, first we're going to show you the compression release setup. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark this push rod real quick so we can see it kind of move up and down. Throw a little white marker on here for you. Okay, now we're going to look for the little bump of the compression release. Right there it was. See it move up and down ever so slightly? You can hear it click actually too as it goes past the lifter. So I'm rotating the motor forward, and the wheel of course in the direction of normal rotation. And as I see that, now I'm going to rotate it forward, as I see that lifter go up and come back down, I know I'm on the base circle of the cam, and then I am past or not on the compression release trigger. So now I'm ready to adjust this rear cylinder on the exhaust and the intake. Okay. So using a 1/4 inch wrench on the bottom of the adjuster and a 7/16 wrench on the push rod, I'm at zero lash. I'm going to take this push rod and extend it 20 flats. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. $20 flats right there. Now, knowing that I'm at the right adjustment, I'm going to grab another 7/16 and I'm going to tighten that adjuster nut. Okay, now one thing you'll notice of course right away is that what we did by adjusting that after we got to zero lash, we have compressed the valve spring and of course opened the valve. So right now the valve is open basically 100 thousandths, because that's what we lengthened the push rod by. So slowly over time here in the next few minutes, this lifter is going to squeeze the oil out of it. Okay, that piston's going to go down to the center of the adjustment, and this push rod is going to start to spin freely. Okay? And that is important to note, because before you can move on to the other cylinder, you must wait for this thing to bleed down, or what will happen is your valve will actually open farther than it should because the lifter hasn't collapsed, and it will contact your piston, bend your valves, and ruin your day. So wait for it to bleed down. You should be able to turn it with your fingers. That's a good, and I certainly cannot turn that with my fingers. So while I'm waiting for this one to bleed down, I'm going to go on. Actually, I've already adjusted the rear one, so that one we can see is I can spin with my fingers. So we wait for this one to bleed down, and then we will rotate the engine so that we have overlap in the rear. Verify that we are not on the Easy Start compression release trigger, and adjust the front push rods. Install and adjust. Okay, it's been about 5 or 7 minutes now, and the push rod is free spinning with my fingers, so the lifter has collapsed. So we can move on to the front cylinder. Now, if we had the limited travel kit installed in this lifter, we would have done the adjustment differently, kind of as follows. We would have adjusted it down the 20 flats and waited for the lifter to bleed down, okay, giving it 5 to 7 minutes, maybe 10 minutes. Give it a half an hour if you like. Just give it plenty of time to bleed down. And so once you've given it the time to bleed down, you start to back off the push rod, and when the push rod gets free, in other words, the spring has closed the valve, and all of a sudden the push rod now has no resistance on it to spin. You'll be able to feel that as you back the wrench off. And so you count backwards from 20 flats, 19, 18, generally at 18 flats, okay, the LT kit on a twin cam at 18 flats will start to come loose. And so from that, you are now bottomed, the piston is now inside the tappet, is now bottomed on that LT kit, that washer, and you're going to back the adjustment off 1 full turn, or 6 flats, okay? So back it off, 6 flats, lock it down, and when you're done with the assembly of the rest of the bike, fire it up and give them some time to pump up. So while we're waiting for these push rods and lifters to bleed down so that we can spin them, I want to just take some time to talk about a variety of products that are out there. You could have push rods from any manufacturer with whatever threads per inch, and a lifter from any manufacturer, as long as it's a hydraulic one with a given amount of travel. We don't know what it is, it doesn't matter. But you should be able to adjust hydraulic tappets on any V-twin, not knowing what the threads per inch is, not knowing what the travel in the lifter is, by simply getting the cam on the base circle, making sure that you are indeed on the base circle. Like we mentioned here, if you have Easy Start cams, you have the compression release trigger to contend with. Make sure that you're not on that trigger. But as long as you're on the base circle of the cam, and you've taken the lash out of the push rod, then basically what you want to do is adjust that push rod longer, okay, and adjust it, 20, 40 flats. Start small so that you make sure you don't open the valve too far. But basically you can keep lengthening a push rod, and it may take you longer to do this procedure, but if you don't have the instruction sheets or you can't get on the tech line and get answers, then this is a way for you to do it yourself. So as you adjust that push rod out, okay, and it bleeds down, if it spins, you're not on the bottom of the travel of the lifter, okay? If you adjust it out and you've waited a half an hour and the lifter doesn't spin, so you've waited plenty of time for it to bleed down, okay, and it doesn't spin, you know you're on the bottom of the lifter. So you start backing off that push rod until it starts to spin freely, okay, or the resistance from backing it off gets easier or reduces. So at that point, you know you're at the bottom of the lifter. You've counted how many flats you went down, and you've counted how many flats you've come back up. And at that point, say you adjusted it down 40 flats, okay? You backed it off 10, so now you're at 30 flats. Well, 30 flats from zero lash is the bottom of the travel of that lifter, okay? So if you want to be in the middle of the travel, you back it off another 15 and you lock it down. So that could be applied to any lifter and any push rod combination imaginable on a V-twin. Okay, now that the lifter has bled down, I can spin the push rods, both intake and exhaust. It's time to extend the push rod tubes and put the clips in. So. Push down the bottom. I just have a skinny straight edge screwdriver here, or standard screwdriver, and the supplied push rod clips that came with the push rod tube kit from S&S. And I basically stick it in there and sweep like so. Get the top and the bottom, seated in the O-rings, and then put the clip up against the top tube and spin them in. Okay, now for the hard one. Just gotta get that connector out of the way. And that's pretty much the end of a push rod adjustment and installation.